Hello, how's it going? We don't have a ton of time, so we're going to start pretty aggressively here and see if we can get through it all. So let's see if I can get my half-broken computer to work. Okay, so this is a talk about Lucky's Tale. We're calling our talk The Unexpected Delight of Third-Person Virtual Reality. It's a technical postmortem, so we're going to do a little bit of everything here and see if some things can stick. So if you want it to roll off the tongue, to Doppler ATP, so that's how you can tell your friends about it. So I'm Dan Hurd. I'm the director of Lucky's Tale.
And I'm Evan, engineer.
And we work for a company called Playful. We're in McKinney, Texas, just north of Dallas. And, 30 minutes isn't a lot of time, so I just want to kind of recap a few things that we're going to be covering here. And so really we want to talk about a little bit of the chronology of how Lucky's Tale came to be. Also, we want to kind of dig into several key points in that process where we had to answer really tough questions about camera, gameplay, and how VR affects kind of both of those things, and how that all ties to comfort. So one of the big things, like the big dream of VR, I think even when we started to figure out that we wanted to make something for the Rift or for VR hardware was we said, okay, we got to get this out of our system. Certainly we can just jump into Lucky's eyes, right, and we're going to be in this really cool virtual world, and we're going to platform like we've never platformed before, right? And it's kind of this thing where we feel like anything you can write on a piece of paper and then you put in VR at the end of it sounds amazing, and it's going to work, and it's going to be fantastic, right? But we hit the wall pretty quickly, obviously. But there were a few key points that we didn't really want to let go. So the things that pushed against what we were trying to achieve were a lot of the first-person shooter gaming conventions, right? How fast do I travel with a first-person controller? How do I turn? These zero-point turns, and basically how do you handle jumping, right? Every single one of those things we tried really led to some sort of discomfort, nausea. It wasn't allowing us to be wholly present within the experience without all these horrible trade-offs. And so that's kind of how we actually came into this third-person idea, which is, well, I'm actually in first person. I'm looking around the world. I'm present. But Lucky, this central character, kind of functions as this focal point for me to he is the outlet for my intent in the game, and I'm kind of along for the ride. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how Lucky came to be, how the game even got started. And so back in 2012, this was kind of pre-Kickstarter days, our boss, Paul Bettner, and several people here, they all went to go see Palmer, go see all kind of the duct tape version of the Rift, right? And even in that early state, as I'm sure many of you have understood, was kind of transcendent in a way. It blew away what we thought virtual reality could be, or how it was presented, and just how present you were immediately feeling. Even though now we look back at that and we're like, whoa, we've come even a long way from there. It was enough to where we had the seed of wanting to make a game for this new hardware. But we didn't know what it was, right? So one of the first things we decided to try and do was create maybe this Wii Sports idea of VR, right? Little tiny experiences that help us justify the hardware, right? And we did it really well with Wii Sports, and particularly bowling, right? There was really widespread adoption of that. So we worked on that for a little bit, and we like game jams, so we did this process where we kind of split off a small strike team, and we gave ourselves 4 hours, and we said, okay, from idea to playable game in Unity is what we're using. Is it fun in 4 hours? And that was a very constrained but a very liberating way to do a game jam, specifically since we'd never made a platformer before and we'd never made anything in VR before. So, and it kind of it pushed back on that designer tendency. I know I have this a lot, which is like, no, you don't see it yet. It's going to be fun. It just needs all the things, right? That doesn't work here. You have to be fun then. And then if you are, then you buy the second half of the day and you can kind of finish up your thought. But we didn't want that to overflow into multiple days or anything, because there's too many things to figure out, too many basic fundamental things to figure out. So we came out of that process with about 35, 36 games in just a couple of weeks, and it was amazing and thrilling and tiring and awesome. And that led to kind of larger prototypes that led to larger ideas that we could kind of solidify. So eventually that led into this thing that we said, well, maybe it's not VR or the Wii Sports of VR. Maybe it's kind of like Nintendo Land, where there's this home we go to, and then you can spoke out from there and go into these little experiences. But in pursuing this goal, we started to find some of the core things that actually made Lucky's Tale what it is today, but we didn't know it yet. So we started to play with the IPD value, and we've talked about that before, where we're scaling the distance between your pupils, essentially making you a giant or really small. In this particular case, we made you very large, and the world shrunk down super tiny. So everything felt very, very model-like, and it was really cool. And I felt we felt present. Just a little toy you could lean into, and that was really amazing. But we also started experimenting with things like a capsule character that would run around. We also had to start dealing with camera issues for the first time, which was, okay, well, this character can kind of like go off around the corner, and what do? We can't catch up to it yet, so how do we start addressing that? And we're going to delve into that a little bit more in detail in just a bit. So from there, we kind of had to hack something together and present a level at E3 2014, and that's where a lot of people got their first glimpse of Lucky's Tale. So there's a very interesting thing that happened there, and that is you can start seeing the fundamental pieces of the aesthetic. They're kind of all here a little bit. A lot of polish went in after that. But Lucky, we call him Fursuit Lucky here, man in a fursuit. Obviously not even just an animal. He's on the road to success, but not quite there yet. We were borrowing really heavily from the games we knew, because that's the best way to figure out something, right? Like, don't reinvent the fun every single chance you get. Try and figure out what works and limit your problem set. For us, it was comfort. And how to present these things with the right angles to where we can completely reduce the overhead of worrying about, where is my camera? How do I control it? Basically, allow the player to focus on the gameplay. So we borrowed heavily from Mario, Banjo-Kazooie, all this stuff. You know, you can even see like the floating block that was just so Mario, right? But we were able to fully test more of how the comfort was, right? So when people started critiquing the game, like, it's fun, but it's a little derivative feeling maybe, it's borrowing heavily, that's great, because people weren't necessarily coming to us and saying, no, I feel sick, I feel terrible. So that was a really big win for us, and that kind of gave us the green light to go ahead and start pushing this forward to something that we're getting a lot closer to today. Which is more polished interactions, defining Lucky the character, defining movesets, encounters, monsters, everything. I mean, we even had like placeholder monsters in that first thing we showed at E3. And so it's come a long way from here. And I'm kind of ending here right now. I'm going to dig in a little bit for each of those beats that we came through. How did we get there? And we're going to specifically address the camera. And Evan's going to talk about that in detail right now.
Yeah, so in the early phase of the capsule prototype, we just had this stubby capsule jumping around on these 1 meter tall cubes in this environment that was generated from a text file. It was completely flat, and the camera was on a track going from left to right. The scale was like viewing a stage from an elevated front row seat. And while it wasn't great, it began to kick off the idea, what's it like to control a character in third person in VR? And so we started to answer that with the second phase. We opened up the level, we added a lot more colors and a lot of things to interact with. Because of the time constraints, we were unable to experiment with a complicated character and camera controller. So for the camera, we didn't have any rotation for it. We just had a velocity-based linear follow camera. And to make up for that in the level, we constructed it in such a way so that the character could almost go to any location, and behind it, the camera could comfortably fit. And because we didn't have any rotation, we also constructed it to where we're constantly going to the right and forward in the level so that we don't have to do any backtracking. And then the core camera logic is just starting with grabbing the delta position for the camera, so we have our desired set that we're going to change, and then scaling this by the speed that we want to go to. We actually have a vector for this that is halved on the y velocity to kind of ease that motion. We experimented with passing this through a sine function as well, so that you could kind of smooth out the motion. And problem with that sine specifically is that as you get really close to the target, the camera kind of lingers on and goes really smoothly for a long time, which doesn't feel that great. We also experimented with putting it through a power function so that we could have a faster ramp up and could also still solve the issue where as the character is moving around in a tiny circle, it kind of gets uncomfortable. But we were able to resolve that by kind of sticking with a simple linear motion. And our character, one unit actually works out really well for us because our character is actually just slightly smaller than 1 unit in width, so 1 is actually a really good ramp-up scale.
Yeah, and it's very interesting about these two different kind of paradigms for camera motion, because the thing we were realizing what people were triggering on was if I stopped my character, right, that's kind of where I'm focusing all my agency, and to feel the camera just kind of ooze into position a little lightly after that was unexpected because I've stopped my character and I'm not expecting motion, and that motion kind of became contextless. And then the other example that Evan presented was the camera would just start unexpectedly. So Lucky might even take a few steps, and then suddenly you go from 0 to something very, very fast, and you may be matching his speed. But again, both from the player's perspective were just unexpected changes in motion.
Yeah, and in the next step of the part, we just clamp the magnitude based on the maximum velocity of the camera so that one ramp-up works out really well. It's actually really important to use the magnitude of the vector rather than the individual components so that you don't have really fast angular speeds. And then we just move towards our target velocity based on our acceleration. And again, it's really important to do this based on the magnitude of the vector rather than the individual components so that you're not moving this awkward zigzag pattern as you go through the level, which can also lead to that discomfort. And then for the island, we wanted to figure out a way that we could navigate it comfortably. And the initial idea that we were going to do with it was just do different camera points, just completely eliminate the camera motion and allow us to have completely perfect placement for it. But we had some problems with that. For starters, we have our character moving over from one zone to the other, and we're watching them, and then as they go to the next zone, we're still looking at it in that direction. And then whenever we blink, although there's no motion sickness from the actual blink motion there, we actually lose track of the character and are unable to temporarily see them. A way that you can resolve this is by actually flipping the motion so that you're still looking in the same direction of the character, but this leads to the problem of your input is in one direction and then your motion is now in the opposite as you're switching sides there. But a potential way that you could resolve this would be, if you wanted to keep the same direction all the time, would be to make it so that the environment fades out but not the character, and then you see the character transition to the point where they'll be whenever you're at the new observer location, and then you fade everything back in.
It's almost like an old school Zelda camera transition where the character is the central focus point and you can track them across your display.
Yeah, we ended up abandoning that because we wanted a more open environment rather than going with the room-based approach. And so the next thing we attempted was constraining the camera to a set of rails. While this would still give us the perfect camera placement, it would also allow us to avoid that issue of losing track of the player as we're moving around through the level. But this does have problems of its own. Firstly, like going around a bend, for example, could be uncomfortable because we see our character and then they move along and the camera moves behind them around the track. And it goes in the opposite direction of your movement, which can be uncomfortable. And the core of that is that as we're moving with the character, we have our character, we apply our input, the character goes forward, and the camera tracks behind them, and that's a motion that we can get used to and be really comfortable with. But whenever the camera moves in this opposite direction, even if it's like just a slight change off to the side, that can lead to this feeling like you're being dragged, which is terrible.
It's tough, and it seems like it's at its worst when your intent and kind of what the camera is doing are at odds with each other. And to kind of even more make that generic, when I have to even think about why isn't the camera why isn't it fading into the background? Why do I even notice the camera? Every single time that happens, it feels unsuccessful, and then it opens the door to kind of for this motion sickness. So in this case, there's some sort of invisible track that I don't see as a player that's guiding my camera, and I might take one step forward and suddenly I'm moving towards the other track, or I might take one step back and I'm on the previous track, and that's not something that we wanted our players to ever have to think about.
Yeah. And so the next type we tried was, instead of having the camera controlled at all times, although a step missed here is that a potential way that you could maintain comfort with that camera rail was by making it to where the camera fits within a distance of the rail rather than maintaining rigidly to it. But you can still lead to these edge cases where the character is moving in one direction, and then instead of the camera following as we're used to, it kind of shifts off to the side so that it can fit within the constraints. Yeah. And then So with the next type, instead of controlling the camera all the time, trying to control the camera in specific zones. So we would still have our follow camera, which is all in one rotation, and then in specific areas where we might clip through the level geometry or like really narrow tunnels, we would apply these zones so that the camera could move and not clip. But with the problems as before, we're actually creating that motion that's away from the direction that you were expecting. But a successful constraint that we were actually able to apply is making it so that as the character jumps, we do not change the vertical position of the camera until you actually get to that new elevation. Because in a platformer, you're constantly jumping around, and
that's not a ride that we want to be a part of as a player.
We don't want to make a Bob simulator for that.
Right, exactly.
But this can also lead to problems whenever you have these really big elevation changes, like if you go up really high or fall down a great distance, is that the camera gets that really uncomfortable drag sensation. But we were able to alleviate this by just having the vertical speed of the camera, because we can get away with a lot more forward velocity for the character, but people seem to be more sensitive to that vertical oscillation.
Right, and there's a few examples even in the shipping version of Lucky's Tale that there's a few camera zones in it. I can only think of really one major one now, and we've ended up nuking most of the other ones because the transitions in and out of those always felt weird. But there's one or two that really map kind of the action that you're expected to perform, and we very gradually kind of move into those, and you might feel the camera just getting a little bit further so you can have a greater field of view over what you're expected to do. But so we found limited success with it, but in many cases you just felt like it was doing something that you didn't want to do and that you were fighting it.
Yeah, and this is also where we discovered the joy of scaling the camera. The first thing that does for us is whenever we bring up the camera, it brings the world scale in and makes it feel a lot smaller and more toy-like, because things that are further than across the room begin to look flat and lose their depth cues. But whenever you scale up the camera, it brings more of the world into this comfortable sweet spot at about arm's reach and really enhances the 3D effect. And also, subconsciously, we know that these characters are like smaller and more toy-like, because this just felt right. Seeing a human-sized Lucky is actually really creepy, not something you want to experience.
Yeah, it feels like vaguely threatening, like who's the real person here? And we didn't want to feel that way with Lucky's Tale. We don't want to compete with him. And it maps pretty well. When you play Banjo-Kazooie or Mario or something, you don't really visualize the world in your mind as what it looks like from first person's perspective. It's like you're playing a game with a toy or something. So with our current scale settings, Lucky, in most cases, appears to be about 6 inches tall, kind of like a little stuffed animal. And then sometimes we play with that a little bit, and he gets really much smaller, which looks like a model. But we do like kind of changing that up every now and then.
Yeah, and perhaps the greatest advantage of scaling up the camera was that you actually experience less motion, because the world feels like it's a lot smaller. So with all the values staying exactly the same, but the camera scaled up, if you scale it up 8 times, you're experiencing 8 times less motion as you move through the world. So we can actually get away with a lot more.
And that was incredibly important. That really helped us unlock, the piece of keeping this as comfortable as we possibly can for as long as we can. That really helped us out.
Yeah, and so there were actually a lot of really fun things to do with the scale. Like in our initial E3 demo, we scaled up the camera about 100 times and disabled most of the interactable objects in the level so that you could actually look in and get this really comfortable feeling.
Yeah, and that gave us kind of the birth of, we have these little dioramas that introduce each stage, and that was born out of, well, we don't have anything. Let's put something together that's kind of cool, but we don't know what's going to happen out of this. And it was really fun and delightful when that happened, and that really folded into the game proper, where, yeah, I actually want this little diorama that introduces my level, and then I go into it, and then I feel like it's all around me. So it was pretty cool. So that's a lot about the different steps that we took to kind of get to E3, and those are the things we were thinking about. And then at that point, we really needed to kick into a production mode. We had seen some things that were very promising, successful, and we needed to really batten down all the pieces from gameplay and so on. But one of the interesting things, like camera does a lot for us, but it's not the only solution. And it can't be, because there's just too many things that we're also needing from a gameplay perspective that immediately kind of conflict with that. So one of the other things was scale, camera movement, and then the last, which does a ton of heavy lifting in Lucky's Tale, is the level design itself. how does that respond to the camera and to the motions that you're trying to do? So we started by looking at, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, some of the games that we loved growing up and some of just the highest pinnacles of 3D platforming, you know. So some things that really inspired us were maybe some of the level designs from Banjo-Kazooie, which were, we yearned to explore this really cool space that we had just created, right? And we also looked at Mario levels, and quite literally what we would do is take a Banjo level, we would model it out, and we'd put it in the Rift, and we'd say, well, we don't know anything, so does this work? Oh. And so we'd look at it and run around, and suddenly the first thing that you would notice is, well, a Banjo level doesn't work because it's built around that conceit of being able to flip the camera 180, 90 degrees, and every level is an arena that you're expected to kind of run back and forth. And we know that we don't like Lucky jumping backwards towards her own face. It doesn't feel good, and it's weird, and it makes you feel like you can't back up fast enough. And then when we make you back up fast enough, you feel sick. So we liked exploration, so that was a key theme. And the next one was we would take a Mario level, and we'd put it in the Rift, and we'd say, okay, how does this work? And in general, it was a little bit more comfortable, but it felt incredibly linear. It's like we've opened the ability for you to look anywhere, but why? Because you're just really funneled into this one direction. There's a right path that you must go on. And some of our initial level prototypes had felt pretty cool, but they felt very linear. So we ended up kind of pulling elements from all these games to make something that kind of addressed all of this. So we do a hub and spoke system where a hub is defined by maybe a pretty small crescent or a larger, wider path. And then we're giving you a lot of options to the side, like left and right, a lot of jumpable platforms, little micro forays that you can get into. And you can go up, collect the doodad, and jump back down. And so we give you a lot of options to go fully explore. A lot of the beginnings of levels have these. When you get a chance to play, you'll see there's many different options, a lot of fun things to go explore. So it's like this immediate burst of, whoa, I can go anywhere. And then we do kind of try to propel you forward. But when we also didn't want to lose that exploration feel. Like, I want to go up there. It looks so cool. How do I do that? So we leverage the fact that jump cuts can feel pretty comfortable. And we have a teleporter object, like a teleport pad. And the kind of the missing pieces were, I need to know that a given branch is not the main path, and that I'm not missing goodies here. Like, I'm the type of player where that would just drive me up the wall, right? Like, oh, what did I trade off? You know, I can't find it all. So we would let you see the end goal. So if a big diamond or something up there, you're just like, hey, that's the end of the path. So you felt more comfortable going up there and collecting it. And then we would give you a teleport pad that would take you back to that decision point, and you'd be like, oh, here I am. That's the path I just went down. And now I can go down this path, or I can go down the main path. And in those instances, the main drawback from jump cutting was if you lost kind of your sense of where you were in the world. And we don't want to do it too often because that starts cutting up the game, and it feels less like I'm in a single place. It feels more game-like in a way, but less like a place. So we would usually give you some big central frame of reference. So maybe the balloon that you jump on at the end, you might go down that path and you're to the left of it, and then you teleport back and you're right, it's dead center, and you immediately can kind of reorient, which was really helpful for us. And so those were some really important pieces. We also wanted to, there's this interesting push and pull between classic game design and what VR kind of promises you as a player. So as I played the game Lucky's Tale, I want to make sure that Lucky is safe. I want to make sure that he can jump and defeat whatever enemies and that he's getting the goodies and all that stuff. When I do that, I'm out of necessity, I have to look at him and I have to focus on what he's doing and how he responds to my input. And that pulls me away from these moments where I feel like I can look around the level. We kind of get one right at the start. You know, you start and everything's new and you look around, and then we see our players kind of getting into the zone. And it's not bad. They're playing Lucky's Tale. But we also wanted to bring in that kind of wonderment of being inside this cartoon world that feels real. So what we ended up doing is in key locations, we will hide things from you. We'll hide the exit a little bit, and we'll clear it out of any monsters or anything that looks threatening. And so what happens is, if I'm used to looking forward or at these 45 or 90 degree angles, and I don't immediately see where I go, what we're noticing is people kind of unconsciously just like, where's the exit? And they'll look around and they'll get distracted and they'll lean in. And it's like all these things that on the tips of our tongues when we're watching people play, we're like, look around, lean in, you know, it's cool. But it's at odds with the gameplay itself. So we kind of wanted to do that within the level design itself. And then it follows this arc where we ramp up the intensity of the gameplay and the jumping and all that stuff, and then we kind of let you exhale and take a breath. And in those moments, we feel like it's okay to let the gameplay wait, because we're telling the story of the level too, as a place, as something that you can inhabit. So what you'll see in several of the levels is maybe sometimes there's just like a little moving platform and it takes you for a ride, connects two pieces of the level, and we give you a lot of crunchy, interesting things to go look at as you kind of move through that space. And we feel like that cadence really helps satisfy both of those goals. And additionally, we have two modes that you unlock when you beat the original mode, which is there's like this really hidden red coin mode where you're looking under things and around things to find the red coins. And in VR, that's pretty fantastic. And it gives you this more methodical approach to exploring the level. And many times people come out of that and say, like, wow, I really saw the level because I had to. I'm looking really hard under things. And then we gave the other thing, which kind of, there's a little bit of something thrilling about maybe jumping off something really tall. But we want those in little spikes, not all the time. So we have a time trial mode that unlocks where we encourage you to take these pretty crazy paths, something you wouldn't do under the constraints of the normal game, but allow you to really press your limits. We give you a few extra monsters sometimes and give you you can succeed if you make a skilled jump. So we're quickly running out of time here. There are some open questions, and we're happy to talk about those kind of as we move on from here. We're going to stick around, so if anybody has any questions, but the big ones are, the things that are out there, we haven't figured it out yet. Jumping kind of back towards yourself. If I look away from Lucky and move the thing, I get contextless movement, which can feel a little weird. And the micro movements, like adjusting yourself a lot just on the same plane and then feeling like the parallax of the environment moving in response to that sometimes can trigger a little bit of discomfort. I think it's very minimized, but we're really interested in trying to figure out and solve those things. And there's plenty of other things. So maybe we have a little time for like a single question or something, but before we get to that, just wanted to thank you all for your attention. It's our pleasure to present this stuff, and thanks a lot. So,
yeah, thank you.
We have any questions?
Microphone not on.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Hello.
So the games that obviously inspired you guys, Super Mario World, one of the biggest, Mario 64. And so I think one of the keys of that was always like lining up a jump when you're a platformer, and so getting the camera to cooperate when it was floating behind you.
Yes.
A lot of people can only ever make a jump straight forward, so you'd constantly be trying to get it instead of doing an angle jump.
Totally.
Is it easier in stereoscopic?
Yeah, because you can actually see the distance between platforms, it's actually a lot easier. So you're not having to rely on this drop shadow or top-down view. You can actually be like, oh, it's about this far. I'm going to do that now.
In many ways, it feels like the most pure representation of this. I feel like the hardware has caught up to the design because, you're not struggling with the camera and you use your actual depth perception. So all that overhead is gone. And I know a lot of people that fell off when like Mario went 2D to 3D. Like, I can't play 3D games. Like, I'm sure we've all heard that a little bit, right? Those are the very same people that we would hope that give Lucky's Tale a chance, because all that confusion and abstraction is gone. And now all that's left is like pure gameplay.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have a little bit more. So, a little more time.
Okay. Yeah. Hi.
Okay, thank you. Can you please share how you published the game and how it performed?
So Lucky's Tale is not actually fully out yet. It's going to be it's a bundle-in game for the Oculus Rift. So when the Rift launches, Lucky's Tale and Eve Valkyrie will both be on it, and that's where we'll start getting all that glorious data.
Hey there.
Hello.
In any of my experiments with third-person games, I've felt the need to try to figure out who you are, the player, in this space, because you feel there. Have you felt the need to do that, or have Lucky acknowledge the player's existence?
Yes, actually, Lucky will turn and face the player and look at you, and if you get too close, he'll get knocked down on his feet. And
it's an interesting question, because there's like this whole meta design path, like who am I, what am I doing, and the main times when those felt like they got into conflict is where we presented something false as your body. You would look down like, I'm sitting, but I'm standing, or vice versa, right? And and obviously like a modeled body is not something that makes sense to us really. You don't buy it yet. So we actually cleared up a lot of that by just not showing a body, but by emphasizing those interactions that you're discussing here. It feels great when you make a really good jump and Lucky turns at you and kind of mugs a little bit. Like, it does feel like I'm on an adventure with a friend, and that's really compelling to us, and that was very important for us to kind of robustly address that, where he's meeting your eyes and he's reacting to you, the entity, together. And we even have a few mechanics that are based on that. There's a level where you're the flashlight and Lucky is completely in the dark without where you're looking, which is a very interesting way to approach a platforming level. And then we also kind of leverage that with our bomb throwing, where you're actually doing the aiming and Lucky is throwing the bomb. So it's kind of together. You can move him independently of that you get really accurate throwing, but it also feels like you've done it something together.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So we're, I think, at our time, but if anybody has some questions, we're just going to pack up and head outside, so please come bug us. Thanks.
Thank you.